Welcome everyone. We continue our series entitled League of Women Voters Empowering You, a program designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access Television to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors throughout the greater Dayton area. My name is David Bodary. I am a member of the League of Women Voters here in Dayton and your host for our program that tonight we discuss the topic of honesty in education, discussing some of the current pieces of legislation that are proposed that could offer changes to instructional practices in our public schools. Our guests today are Val Lee, who is a member of the League of Women Voters here in Dayton and the Action Committee Chair, and Dr. Karen Leith. She is the League of Women Voters State of Ohio Board Member and Chair of the State Advocacy Committee. Val and Lee are with us on Zoom, and I welcome you both tonight. Hi, Val.
Hello, good to be here.
And hi, Karen.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
Val, could you tell us a little bit about your work with the Action Committee and perhaps tell us more about how you got to know Karen?
Sure. Actually, my work as the Action Chair just puts me in connection with people like Karen, and so I love that position. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about Karen because She's much more interesting. Karen has a bachelor's degree in the areas of math and economics, so that pretty much validates her high intellect. She has a master's degree in religious studies, and that provided a foundation for her guiding principles. And she has a PhD in the area of psychology, and that set her career path. So she wears many hats for League of Women Voters, but I know her best in her role as advocacy chair. And I learned so much from being with Karen, or from learning from Karen as she conducts meetings, and you know that she's a real force to be reckoned with as she works with both sides of the aisle. She's a real nonpartisan figure for LWV, as we all need to be. But people will listen to her because she's to be listened to.
Absolutely. Thanks, Val. You're underestimating your influence in our community, too. You do some great work for our local league, and I thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Karen, you may or may not realize that I have actually, on this program, interviewed with former state school superintendent Paulo Di Maria. But I understand that one of the things you're involved in is knowing a bit about what's happening at the state school board level as they search to replace Paulo Di Maria. Can you share anything about that?
Well, actually, all that we're talking about tonight is interrelated about honesty in education. And as you have been following the news, you know that there's been a little controversy around our state school board having to do with the July 2020 resolution on racism and equity. And that resolution was rescinded. And the fact that the former board president, Laura Kohler, was asked to step down because she voted against rescinding the resolution. In fact, Laura was one of the authors of the original resolution, has created some concerns. And in fact, the state school board met yesterday and today, and I was listening to some of it today, as they tried to walk back on some parts of the strategic plan, some portions of their whole child framework, and trying to get rid of terms like worrying about the wellness of our students. So basically, honesty in education has been following all of this. This is part of a very conservative movement to remove any talk or principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion from our schools, whether we're talking about the state house bills or the local school board or the state board. Well, the board is not using a search committee to find a new superintendent right now, from what I understand. So basically, Honesty is very concerned about the leadership qualities, having interviewed Paulo Di Maria, you know what a force he has been and what a good force in how focused he has been on students and the number of ways he's used collaboration and stakeholder input in terms of the whole child framework, in terms of the strategic plan. So we're very worried about the qualities that our state board will be looking for in a new superintendent. So actually, you can actually find the honesty in education principles on the website, along with some of the qualities we think a new superintendent should have. We are encouraging individuals as parents, as grandparents, as educators, as interesting citizens to write testimony about the search for a new state superintendent. This is going to be very key in terms of how our local school boards can function in the classroom as school boards, how our superintendents also can function.
Absolutely. But that's not all, right? Because, of course, this relates to some of the other things that we hope to talk about. Some of the local school boards, too, have had disruptions and interferences or interruptions, at least. So that's part of this conversation as well. But this also links back to some legislation that was introduced last spring. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. In fact, this is part of a national movement, and I can't underscore that enough. It is part of a conservative national movement to get at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's some key terms that are being bantered around that everyone's heard that are being misused and misdefined. And the most important key term there is critical race theory. And we basically, those of us who have looked at critical race theory know it actually came about in law schools. It is a legal framework to look at systemic racism. It's looking at the structures that have created the inequalities in our system and asking, why do they still persist? Where did they start? How do we do something about it? But that's from, again, a law school perspective. Critical race theory does not enter the K through 12 curriculum. It does not enter an undergraduate education in our institutions of higher ed. But yet this group has used that as a term to rally conservatives to basically look at the curriculum and at all levels. And so our legislature now is doing something very different. They're stepping in where local school boards have always made decisions in terms of how basically what's taught and how it's taught is determined. So the two bills are HB 322, which only deals with K through 12 public schools, and that's really important, K through 12 public schools,
Right.
because that bill has been quiet. And that one talks about prohibitive topics. And the reason is they actually list topics that should not be included. Now, HB 327 has been getting bigger and bigger. There have been two substitutes for that bill, because that seems to be the one that the committee in the House is focused on. Interesting about these bills, and that talks about divisive topics. It's a little bit nebulous in terms of how to define them. And in testimony, when people bring up, well, you're saying we can't teach, and the authors of that, the sponsors, because they are not the authors, the sponsors of that bill, Representative Grindell and Representative Arthur Fowler, basically say, oh yes, But you can do that as long as it's balanced and you present two sides. And then you bring up something else and they go, no, 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 no. And so people keep saying, well, what is a divisive concept that we can't teach?
Well, and I guess, Karen, I want to
current
ask.
events, you know, et cetera. Also, what's disturbing about HB 327 is its punitive nature.
Okay.
So if someone basically says, oh, they're violating this, there are two ways that is punitive. The teacher threatened with loss of license, and the school system threatened with loss of public funds. So basically, what's interesting too, and I'll put this in now, and then you can ask your next questions. This is not in the House Primary and Secondary Education Committee, because they're educators. This is in the Local Government Committee, because that's where the two sponsors of the bill reside.
I see.
And that every member of the Republican caucus that's a member of that committee is a co-sponsor of the bill.
Okay.
Okay.
So is it typical for our elected officials to become involved in the curricular issues of our schools? I guess I thought that's what school districts, that's what the superintendents would be involved in, that typically it's the educators that make determinations about curriculum. Is this something I've missed? Is this something new?
This is something very new. You are very right, David. We have in the past lived in a state where there's a lot of local control, whether it's city entities, township entities, or school boards. Prime example. The whole idea of it being a local issue is so that parents have input.
Right.
That, you know, we look at the community making those decisions, because it's the community that elects the school board, which hires the superintendent, and they're monitored by the superintendent. We're seeing a general trend in this particular General Assembly in terms of removing or restricting local control, not only on education, but several other issues. But right now, a huge focus on education. What's very interesting too is not even our state school board interferes in the selection of textbooks and the way a topic is taught. If you look at the strategic plans of our state school board, they deal with skills that they want students to have, general concepts that our students should have in order to be basically successful, good members of a U.S. democracy. The fact that the legislature now is trying to dictate what's actually taught or not taught in the classroom is very new.
There's so many things I want to talk about, and yet obviously we can't talk about everything, but I guess part of me wonders if local control is typically the way it's been done. I thought that was the generally conservative approach, that more typically conservatives want local control. And what I hear you saying, Karen, is that they want local control unless they don't. I guess I'm a little confused. So they're suggesting that they don't want to talk about divisive concepts, and yet they want students to learn. How do you learn if you can't talk about difficult conversations? So I have a number of questions. And Val, I don't want to lose track of you, but Val, in Dayton, we recently had an exhibit at the local library downtown relating to redlining. And you know, it's a very informative and I think illuminating exhibit. It very much follows The Color of Law, a book that was encouraged and we've read certainly on my campus. Val, The Color of Law book about redlining and then the exhibit on redlining, that's real, right? That's factual information. We're not making this up.
Right. No, there are a lot of ways that you can supplement what is taught in schools. But I think a lot of people really just don't understand the culture of schools and the role of the school administrator. And if you have a very strong school administrator, they handle a lot of these disputes and concerns raised by parents. That's sort of like the first step, and many times the last step in coming to some resolution, or that's the way it always has been. But now the legislature wants to get involved because they just feel that there's some great need on their part, or they need to get reelected, and so they need to respond to a disgruntled parent. But I don't think that's putting us on a good path.
Right.
That's a really good point, Val, and it's really interesting too, because one of the things about HB 327, it also governs public governmental entities, so that basically, say the city of Dayton wanted to talk about the redlining and possible solutions to that. That makes people, according to the bill, that makes people feel bad. That might make people feel as if they're to blame. So therefore, it's a divisive concept and should not be talked about. It's yes, David, I can see your reaction.
Thank you.
You know, as an educator myself, it's like, how do we come to solutions? How do we learn if we can't talk about this? And I think many of us, basically, actually, I loved The Color of Law because it put all of what happened with education and housing in perspective for me. And, you know, the questions, you know, going back, where I was too young to pay attention to what was happening, and you know, answering that question, because I came through teaching in for a couple of years in the Chicago public schools, and you know, saw the schools that never improved because they were built out of the remnants of what other people didn't want. Right. So you know, it's really important, which is why we decided to call this campaign Honesty in Education from the positive point of view, because we need those honest conversations.
Absolutely. So then what's the League's position on this current legislation, and what can people do about it?
Good question. Great question. We are very opposed to it. And we have been working very hard. In fact, our lead issue specialist, Cynthia Peoples, has actually worked very hard putting together a very strong coalition. You know, League is not only League can do its advocacy as League, but one of our strengths is also the allies we bring into it and the coalitions we form. In fact, when they opened testimony, opponent testimony on HB 327 and 322, we had 600 people offer and send in testimony, right, such that they couldn't even upload it to the Ohio legislative website, and they shut it down.
Okay. They
actually shut it down. So the next time they had a hearing on it where they introduced a sub-bill, they said no testimony. Yes. So we've made a very strong presence. So what can leagues do? Okay, again, multiple action, because it's not only the legislature. You can write testimony, you can follow the bills. Now, the key to testimony is you cannot submit testimony until the bill is actually on the committee agenda. Okay. And then you have to have your testimony in 24 hours in advance. That's number one. Number two, written testimony on the qualities of a next state superintendent, because that superintendent's leadership is going to make a huge difference. And then, very important, as Val said, the local school board, because this issue is being fought on all of those levels.
Okay.
And the whole idea of legislation is to override those school boards who have DEI policies, who have diversity, equity, and inclusion. I shouldn't use shortcuts, plans. And so basically, in the next few weeks, you're actually going to see league rollout toolkits, much like we have in terms of developing relationships with your legislators, to say, develop a healthy relationship with your local school superintendent and your local school board. And basically the beginning of that toolkit is just going to be the relationship building. And because honestly, our superintendents are under the gun on this, and they're being harassed and threatened, and so are our school board members. I live in Hudson. Our school board, our superintendent is resigning and going to private business over this. He has small children. You know, the stress is just, and the threats are incredible. So we need leagues to actually support their superintendents. So basically, if your school district does have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, plan, principals, we're encouraging leagues to write letters of support saying, we're behind you. We're basically saying, monitor, observe your school boards, and where necessary, support them and develop these relationships so that they know you are there in their camp.
Good. So I understand too that the Senate bill, I think it's the Senate bill, is not just addressing the primary schools, but would also address some higher ed as well as local government. Is that right, Karen?
There actually is no Senate bill at this point.
Oh, okay.
And we're very cautious about this, okay. But before the holiday, President Matt Huffman of the Senate basically said that this decision belongs with boards of education, state and local, and not in the legislature. And he's not sure the Senate will entertain the bills, but that's to be seen with primaries coming up and how big it becomes a primary issue. But the bill that includes higher education is HB 327.
Okay.
And it's basically saying all publicly funded higher institutions of education should not be having this. Now think about some of our institutions and some of the majors that have developed over the years. In terms of, and I should say, you know, sometimes people define these bills only as race, but they're also dealing with gender identity.
Sure.
And that's a huge portion of it. And that's the elephant in the room a lot of times where people don't want to name it. So we've got gender studies in our higher institutions where, you know, the bill actually says that, you know, both bills actually talk about this a little bit. And there is a line in HB 322 that says a teacher may not affirm the gender fluidity issues. So, yeah, think about it in terms of our education focused on the student and the success of the student, and how important students need to be affirmed in who they know they are. You know, the culture, the social emotional pieces of it that facilitate learning. This is part of it. So yes, we're basically, in fact, in the Honesty Coalition, some of our associations dealing with higher education are joining the coalition, especially as focus has been on the HB 327 as the bill that might be the one that comes out of the House.
Okay. Well, we've run out of time, and I somehow knew this was going to happen. I want to obviously thank all of you, and I want to thank Lacey too for doing the interpreting. A couple thoughts that I had. Ohio includes at Central State a historically black university. How do you do the work that they do so well if we're putting sort of restrictions on what it is that they do? So I'm struggling to understand exactly what the goal is of some of the legislation. I'm confused as to how conservatives are suggesting that they don't want local control, because I thought that was what they wanted. And I guess I'm struggling as well to understand who wins in this. So I'm not asking for a response. We are out of time. But I want our viewers to think about what we talk about here often, and Val, you know it to be true. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It's something that we have to be engaged in, and it's something that we have to participate in. We can't just watch it happen, because if we watch it happen, it could run right over us. We want to make sure that people understand what's happening in their community, but also at the State House. And I want to encourage people to become more informed. Karen, I just want to thank you so much for your taking time with us. Dr. Karen Leith is the League of Women Voters State of Ohio board member and chair of the State Advocacy Committee. And Val, I want to thank you. You are our action chair, committee chair, and you have been such a great example of a person who is actively engaged in democracy every day, and you're doing it in all kinds of ways in our community, and I want to thank you for that. I've really enjoyed our conversation. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to participate in every election. If you have any further questions about this or upcoming programs, you can contact the League by emailing league@lwvdayton.org. It's there on the screen. Or you can call our phone number. That is at the office, 937-228-4041. It's on the screen. I want to thank our guests, I want to thank the viewers, and I want to thank everyone for sharing your time. Be well.